Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Coffee and Tea with AARP Connecticut, where AARP staff and volunteers engage with Connecticut decision makers about policies and programs that matter to older residents. I'm John Erlingheuser. I'm the Senior Director of Advocacy and Community Outreach here at AARP Connecticut, and I'm delighted to be joined today by one of our outstanding AARP Connecticut volunteers, Clayton Mansfield. Clayton, thanks for being with us today. Would you like to share a little bit about your role at AARP and maybe tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, John, and good afternoon, Madam Secretary. I'm Clayton Mansfield. I live in Mystic, Connecticut, right near the seaport and the aquarium. I say I live in Mystic because that's my zip code, and also because it sounds cooler than saying I live in Groton, which I technically do. But I joined AARP about a year ago as my career in the federal government was winding down, and I have been active in, advocating for AARP's legislative priorities and being trained to do some of their programs, like our program on choosing an electric supplier.
Okay, so it's also my pleasure to welcome Connecticut Secretary of State Stephanie Thomas, who has been our Secretary of State. She's in her fourth year. Thank you for joining us, Madam Secretary. And could you start by maybe telling us a little bit about your background outside of being a Secretary of State? What other offices you may have held, either locally or in the state, and where you're from, and a little bit about your background.
Sure, and thanks, John. Happy to be here in Clayton. Your story is civic engagement in action, so it's my all-time favorite subject. But yeah, I never actually thought I'd be in politics at all, as you know, John. I spent 30 years in a nonprofit fundraising career, first working as a grant writer for the American Red Cross of Greater New York. I also did a lot of fundraising research work, fundraising special events. Eventually, I opened my own consulting company, helping to raise many nonprofits in New York, mainly, usually about $20 million a year. And then a few years ago, I got bit by the political bug in that I just thought I didn't like the way someone was doing something. So I stepped up and ran. I lost my first election, but I ran again. I won. And then I served a term in Connecticut State House representing Norwalk, Wilton, and Westport. And then I ran for Secretary of the State, and here I am.
That's a great story, and it's a great tale for folks who, see how far you can go when you see something that you want to get fixed, and you decide to get involved and start to work to fix it. And we're very pleased to have a great partner in Madam Secretary.
That's
so Clayton,
that's either good news or bad news, John. How involved you can get.
Yeah, for sure. We always tell our volunteers, the ones we know the volunteers that do, because they take on everything. So we have some good folks, and Clayton is one of them. So Clayton, why don't you tackle the next?
Yeah, Secretary Thomas. When people think of your office as the Secretary of State, most people think you do the election. But I suspect that your role is a great deal more than that. Could you tell us a little about your responsibilities in your role as Secretary of State?
I'd be happy to, because when I quiz most audiences, only 1 in about 30 people know what the Secretary of the State does here in Connecticut. So we do oversee the administration of elections, which is how a lot of people know us. But the biggest part of our office, we run the business registry. So anyone who is operating a business or starting a business in Connecticut is interacting with our office to file their initial paperwork, to file their annual report. If they're just looking into how to do it, that's all our website. Lesser known, we also keep a lot of records. So every single time a law gets passed, we store the paperwork around it. We license notary publics around the state, and we keep a lot of other different types of records. I always say, If you want to know if your town or how your town voted the year Abraham Lincoln ran for president, you can look that up on our website. We have a lot of old data.
People have absolutely I agree with you, Madam Secretary. I have no idea the amount of things that happen in your office once you get, and I knew, having been a former registrar, I knew how much work goes into your office in terms of running elections. But when I first got involved as a registrar, I was amazed at the level of things, particularly, as you said, with regards to businesses in Connecticut that pass through the purview of your office. So it's really, really a lot. So with that, why don't we talk a little bit about elections, since we touched upon it a little bit. I know over the last several years, and particularly with a lot of what done with the leadership review in your office, there have been, great strides in elections in Connecticut, from going one of the more restrictive states when it comes to people's ability to exercise their franchise to one of the more accessible ones. And, AARP, we believe people should, be able to exercise their right to vote freely, easily, and safely. So why don't you tell us about some of the more important advancements we've made to provide folks the ability to exercise their right to vote?
Sure. And I think you touched on something really important, and it's always been my priority as well. Where is that balance between safety and security, but also access? And I think early voting is one of those reforms that does both. A lot of people in Connecticut love to vote in person. So early voting started in 2024. We rolled it out in every town across the state. We now have 2 years of data. In 2024, in the presidential election, 40% of the people who voted used early voting. It's in person for elections, depending on the type of election. It can be 7 days in a primary, 14 days in a general election. People were able to go to a location in their town and vote in person. And the hours were 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. And on some nights, it even stayed open to 8 p.m. And I heard from so many different types of people how much they appreciated having that option. Another big change we made last year, we rolled out new tabulators. Those are the machines you feed your ballot into. And our equipment hadn't been upgraded in 18 years. I like to say before the iPhone was invented. So we were able to get a bonding investment, and we purchased the new equipment. And last year it rolled out in every single town in Connecticut. And what I like about it is the screen. If hopefully all of you voted and saw it, the screen is much larger, so it's really easy to see, and it's really easy to see if something was wrong with your ballot, like you didn't fill out the bubbles correctly, so it got rejected. It's really easy to see when your vote is actually counted. So those are just two of the biggest reforms that have taken place in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I can tell you, I was just going to say, I remember back when I was a registrar, we went from the old lever machines to the new OptiScan machines, which weren't even new. In fact, was an old technology when we started using those machines. And I can just say, I thought the new machines were very much user friendly. And I tell you, I voted early in all 3 elections. I was able to vote in our municipal, our presidential, and our presidential primary. And what I was most pleased about the experience is I think the municipality that I lived in improved upon how they were enacting it each time. So I think that was always a good experience, that, going from the first time, to this last election. So I think that was great. And I know your offices provide a lot of guidance as to towns to how to make it a system that works for voters. So thanks for that.
That's
Clayton.
high praise from a former registrar, so thank you.
Thank you.
Secretary Thomas, yeah, I agree that the early voting process and the new voting machines are great, but in 2024, AARP worked to remove the prohibition on no excuses absentee balloting from the state constitution, partly for people like me who have mobility limitations, and it can be difficult for me to get to the polls. So voters overwhelmingly approved that amendment to remove that prohibition. So do you see the legislature passing laws to implement no excuse absentee balloting? And if so, when do you see it taking effect?
I do, Clayton, and thank you for making the case why absentee ballots and early voting need to coexist. A lot of people have approached me saying, now that we have early voting, we don't need no excuse absentee voting. But my argument is it's for different types of people. Early voting is still in person. So if you have a hard time making it to the polls, early voting doesn't in and of itself solve that problem. So last year, the legislature looked at no excuse absentee, and I don't mind saying they were eager to pass something. I wanted them to wait, and I'll tell you why. The main reason is what we actually just talked about: balancing safety and security with access. There was a thought, just because of the time frame, all we had to do was get rid of the excuses and just let anybody vote by absentee ballot. And part of the reason I was against that is that our current system was not built for the volume of votes that might come in through that manner. So a lot of the states that have had no excuse absentee voting for decades, I think, are doing it right. And I would like to see Connecticut adopt some of those safety reforms. Some of it has to do with more robust tracking so that a voter can track everything from the time they apply for the ballot to the time it's counted. And one of the key steps that Connecticut does not currently have is an opportunity to tell the voter that they've been rejected somewhere in the process, maybe because of a clerical error, something can't be read or can't be verified. So I would like to see our system build in more of those checks and balances so voters can make sure that their vote is being counted. And there are other security features that I've now spoken to the legislature about. I'm assuming they will take it up this year, and I know AARP will be right there to advocate for all of its members.
We really appreciate that, and that's absolutely right. I was talking to a group of our volunteers about issues the other day, and this issue came up, particularly about curing or fixing mistakes in your absentee ballot. And I tell them, when you vote absentee ballot currently, we don't open those ballots till election day, and if there's a mistake with your ballot, your vote
You're
is
out of
negated.
luck.
You get checked off as having voted, but your vote isn't counted if there's a mistake. And yet all the other states that do this do have this ability for you to be informed. And that's one of the key features. And we appreciate that you're advocating for that. So, that's really amazing and a great thing to do. So now we're in the thick of the 2026 legislative session. What other priorities do you have that you'd like to see the legislature pass, especially if you think about the voter age 50 plus? What do you think? Any other major things that you think will help the 50 plus voter?
Yeah, I think a lot of voting reforms help everyone. We have a lot of bills that we had proposed last year that died on the calendar. A couple of things that we've heard from everyone about, and I'm assuming over 50 as well. Um, People would like to see early voting use the tabulators instead of being put in an envelope. That is something that we would have done from the outset, but our equipment was too old. So now we are proposing that bill again, and I expect it to pass. Some people have privacy concerns. There are a lot of checks and balances to protect your privacy, but people just felt concerned about it. We also have a number of election security bills that we are putting in, a lot of bills to make registrars' jobs easier. And although it doesn't impact one community above another, I believe that the more efficient and more well-run our elections are, everyone benefits, right? And I'm trying to think, other than no excuse absentee voting, which I do really think impacts over 50, most of our other reforms are just ways to tighten up and make the entire system more secure.
That's great, and we really do appreciate that. Clayton.
Yeah, during an election, it takes, I mean, a lot of people to be willing to give up their day and work long hours to make sure that the election is organized and safe. And AARP members frequently work as are poll workers during an election. So if some of our viewers are interested in being a poll worker, who should they contact?
That sounds like a straightforward question, but it's a little complex, more complex than one would think. So we oversee elections. However, registrars do not work for us. They are duly elected in their own right in almost every town in Connecticut. And as you know, we have 2 registrars in every single town, a Republican and a Democrat. So registrars hire poll workers, and every single town is different. Some prefer to hire people they know firsthand. Some will put out a call on their website. So you can always call your registrar and ask if they're looking. You can also go to the Secretary of the State's website. We have a poll worker interest form, which you can fill out. And basically, we take that information and send it to the registrar, but they're under no obligation to take that person on. So one thing I'm considering is starting what I'm calling a poll worker academy. We ran a program for the last 2 years for college students around Connecticut. We created the program, we won a grant for it, and we brought on 60 college students. We trained them, not only poll worker training, but moderator training, our voter registration system training, and we pair them with a registrar as a mentor. And in 2 years, those 60 students worked over 2,000 hours at the polls. And I'm considering creating something like that for adults, because what we found was once we could vouch for the training they received, the registrar was happy to have someone do the work for them and bring them on. So, and I'm hoping a program like that might also attract the next generation of assistant registrars, deputy registrars, and registrars of voters. So stay tuned. I'm working right now with a couple of retired registrars on how we might create such a program.
That's really great. I know I mean, sometimes it's really just hard to get folks. And again, people don't understand how much goes into it. And it's a big commitment,
Yeah.
but it's an important thing. And so I know we often get asked about, hey, how do I get to be a poll worker? And I know it's, as you said, a complex thing, but I think that's really great information, and hopefully people will heed the call and take that on. So now we're getting close to the end, Madam Secretary, but I do want to ask you one last question.
Mhm.
Where do people go for just information about voting and elections in general? Like, what do voters need to know about, and on top, to where to go about getting information? What do voters need to know about accessibility at the polls? I know there's been a lot of advances in accessibility for voters, and is there anything else you want to let our viewers know before we wrap up?
Yes, thank you. The most important thing for all viewers is to understand that elections are different in every single state in America. And what I'm seeing now is a lot of misinformation, sometimes through no one's fault, because people assume that elections here work like elections in Arizona or Michigan or Alaska, but they're all very different. So my number one thing that I would like to implore everyone is to go to our website. That is where you get your trusted election information. myvote.ct.gov. If you have any questions from accessibility to language to registration to how you can vote, you can find all of that at myvote.ct.gov. And we do have a special page about accommodations from the voting machine that you can use a digital touchscreen if you have fine motor skill issues, or you can listen to your ballot if you have visual issues, to ASL translation at your polling location and beyond. So please go to myvote.ct.gov.
Well, we really, really appreciate all this really valuable information. And, I often tell people that voting is not a privilege. It's an absolute right. And I think all of these things that we discussed today have been just great expansions in the state of Connecticut. When you talk about, people think about Connecticut, we think we're somewhat more of a progressive state. And yet when it came to elections, we were so much further behind other states. And thankfully, a lot of it through your leadership in the last several years, we've made a lot of strides in Connecticut, and we're continuing to make them. And we really do appreciate that. So any other fine parting words, Madam Secretary?
Thank you for listening. Please vote in every single election. Thank you very much.
Well, we appreciate you being on with us today. And I also want to thank Clayton Mansfield, one of our great AARP volunteers. He represents hundreds of volunteers we have across the state of Connecticut, and everything that we do wouldn't be able to get done if it weren't for our great volunteers. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Tea with AARP Connecticut. Please be sure to join us for future episodes and catch up on past ones on demand right here on our Facebook page or our YouTube channel. And if you want to make a difference, you could scan this QR code and become an AARP e-advocate and help us advance policies that matter to Connecticut's 50+ community. Thank you, everybody.